So last time on RPG Adventures from Scratch, we went through the background story of a bioterrorism plot set in a cyberpunk-ish sort of universe. It's not specifically based on a system. This is all about how to build a successful campaign that people can play through. And it's time now to look at the themes and the relevant scenes that will spill from that description. Before we begin, however, a very quick reminder of the narrative. This will omit a lot of the detail. In fact, some of the detail may not even find it into any part of the adventure beyond the GM's notes. So first thing to note, the GM's notes are not a thing that can be glossed over. They are not unimportant and they must be entirely accurate. They are the key information that will allow the GM to make good decisions during play, ones that don't conflict with any of the things you've written and they may blunder into later in the game. Our narrative involves a group of independent operatives hired by Intron to investigate a break-in at one of their facilities. A piece of their technology called Signogene has been stolen, and if used in the most despicable way imaginable, it could be used to release a toxin into an environment that would only harm Intron employees, leaving bystanders completely unaffected. And this is the reason Intron has hired outside contractors, the party, though they're not going to be revealing this. Now, the GM knows that the group responsible are a terrorist, or activist, or somethingist band of long-haired lunatics called Freedom from Fear, or F3. We know that F3's plan is a two-part attack. They're going to use most of the material they stole to launch a public attack on a convention that will have many Intron people in attendance. Simultaneously, they've built a small-scale production facility to manufacture more of the material so it can be used in future tailored attacks. And not just against Intron, but against anyone that they have the relevant information about. Our intrepid, or possibly insipid, group of heroes are on the case. If you do want more detail, and I couldn't blame you because that was a very, very skimmed version, it's all in part 1. But this is enough to introduce the 3 factions in the story and make the basics of the plot clear enough for right now. So next thing to do is look at the 3 factions. So let's first of all ask why there are 3 factions. 3 is a very good number, but it's not the only choice. It's entirely possible to make a 2-faction campaign. 2 is the typical number for a standalone one-shot type game. You have your party of PCs and some specific objective that they must complete. It doesn't mean there's no 3rd faction. Maybe they're hired by some villagers, for example. But there's no distinction between the motives of the villagers and the motives of the party. This kind of structure has the benefit of being very simple. It also has the disadvantage of being very simple. Worse, it completely falls apart the moment your party does anything not in your plot. If the story is to retrieve the stolen item from the castle and return it to the village, then what happens if your party decides not to? There's no plan B. None at all. In such a 2-faction game, there are the people the party represents, or sometimes just themselves, and an enemy to face, an obstacle to overcome. Now, in early modules of Dungeons & Dragons, for those who can remember that far back, the booklet forms with the letter number code, it was very common for the plot hook to be, you decide to enter the dungeon in search of fame and fortune. Seriously, that's it. That's the whole plot hook. Now, I'm going to remind you that this is not the end of your module if the party decides to not do so. If you've watched the GM's Back Pocket series, hint hint, earlier segments of this behind the screen series, you'll know I always make key encounters modular. In other words, the party can decide to skip the dungeon and go on to the next village, do some shopping, play some cards. That's all fine, as long as eventually they start running out of money and want some magic items and go looking for a dungeon to crawl through. And when they make that decision, then whichever remote mountain cave they enter, whether it was the first or the 11th you told them about, happens to have the pre-designed module behind it. Maybe the details of the terrain don't match, but that's easily fixable on the fly. In a campaign, the thing that cannot be fixed is that encounter where they kill the ogre and find in his treasure the map that leads them to the island on which they find the... well, you get it. And is this railroading? Well, yes, of course it is. But think about this. If you're dealing with a two-faction campaign, then railroading is inherent. There's no plan B, remember. So perhaps a third faction is called for. This is the structure you'll be familiar with from Star Wars and Harry Potter. There's a faction of good guys and a faction of bad guys, and we then drop our heroes into the middle. They actually can choose either side. Now, the entire campaign is completely theirs to play with, which is better, for a campaign at least. Gives them more depth. We'll come back to how it becomes possible to play it either way later, but for now we're going to assume that however self-interested, our players are going to go the Intron route and try to stop F3. We're doing this simply to make the campaign easier to follow. Not because we're eventually going to decide that for the players. They can decide those things for themselves. So let's talk about theme briefly. We're going cyberpunk-ish here, not a specific system. This is not actually Cyberpunk the game, this is Cyberpunk the setting. It's Cyberpunk the environment. So your players deserve environments, plots, options that thematically fall into a cyberpunkish story. So hackers aren't actually wizards, bodyguards aren't knights in shining armour, armoured limousines aren't warhorses. These tropes are fine in a fantasy setting, but in a cyberpunkish one we need the right feel for our people and places, not just existing fantasy tropes redressed. So let's start with the 3 locations we automatically know we're going to need, that we literally cannot do without. The Intron office, where the break-in takes place, that's the actual instigating event for the whole story. The convention centre and the F3 biohacking facility, where they're replicating the Signagene technology. So those are the locations for the instigating event at the beginning of the story and the 2 resolution events. So we have a minor corporate office, a large, slick convention centre, and a dodgy, off-the-grid biohacking facility. Now, if you know any cyberpunk, those 3 locations almost write themselves. And later on we're going to cover the relevant descriptions, but for now just let your imagination picture them, because I promise you, if you know some cyberpunk, what you're imagining is exactly right. We're also going to need some key characters at this point. Again, let's start with the obvious ones. We're going to need a corporate type who's the client for the purposes of hiring the PCs. We should have also a corporate heavy who conducted the initial internal investigation of the break-in. And on the F3 side, we're going to need at least the leader of the group, possibly the overall leader, possibly a local leader running this cell, and we're also going to need a scientist, someone running the biohacking facility. We might have another who could lead the convention centre raid, or any number of additional characters, But for now, we're going to go with just 4 key NPCs. This is our starting set. So Mallory Court, a senior Intron executive. Cold expression, heartless in business, had her ethics shot off in the war. You know the type. Jack Gunn, leader of Intron Internal Security. Former Special Forces, no imagination, no sense of humour. Cassandra, no last name, it's a nom de guerre. Figurehead of the local chapter of F3, Freedom from Fear. Charismatic, courageous, but utterly avaricious. Money is the only possible motivation for her, and there's nothing she wouldn't do for enough of it. And Joseph Harvey, once a respected scientist, working for one of Intron's rival corporations. Gambling and narcotics addiction led to him being a target for blackmail, and he eventually fell into the grasp of F3. Constantly on edge from ongoing drug problems, he's quite psychotic now, and he runs F3's biohacking space. And remember our 3 factions. Let's quickly note down the individual things that each of them needs. Intron, they want their stolen tech back or destroyed. They want to make sure nobody can replicate it. They want to keep the techniques used to weaponize it secret. And, well, possibly they'd like an example to be made of F3 so that other potential criminals are discouraged. Mallory Court, the director of the division that lost the material, is concerned with her promotion prospects. She wants all this to go away, and fast. Now for F3, if they were ever truly a moralistic anti-corporate group, those days are long gone. This cell is led by Cassandra, a woman whose morality is for sale, and who is expecting the operation to net her many millions. And the party. Well, the party's motivations are up to them. The characters are the ones they bring with them. It really is that simple. When you're writing the campaign, short though it may be, you're not in charge of what the players do or think. Really. I've tried, it doesn't work. So, Intron are not exactly good guys, but neither is F3. The party can plot whatever path they choose, and there are a number of possible endings. In fact, every party going through the campaign will choose a slightly different path, probably. And that's fine. In theory, there are 2 resolution points in this campaign. A showdown at the biohacking facility, and a showdown at the convention. They could happen in either order. We are, however, going to assume for the moment that following the clues from the break-in will lead to the biohacking facility first, and it is there that the party will learn of the convention centre attack. And why this way round? Well, it's really just because that makes the final showdown the one where we face Cassandra, the most senior of the F3 people. So what do we do if the party wants to approach things in the other order? We want to make sure that the stakes are higher in the final resolution than in the intermediate resolution. So if the party goes the way we originally thought, then the stakes are higher, because there's about to be a very public attack on a huge event led by the local cell leader of a violent group. If you kill Cassandra, the entire cell falls apart, but the battle could be messy and filled with innocent bystanders. Most of all, there's a clock on it. When planning how to take down the biohacking facility, our party has all the time in the world, in theory, to plot their approach. In the convention centre attack, They have to intervene before events spiral out of control and people start dying. And finally, this is the event where Mallory Court, our Intron executive, is also present. She'll be witnessing the final act, potentially a victim of it. So all of this means that the convention centre attack feels much more important than the biohacking facility attack. But, as I said, players are obstreperous bunch, and what if they go the other way? Well, if they go the other way, you adapt the plot just a little bit. Because the convention centre attack has now already happened. Either Cassandra survives and returns to the biohacking facility, now a fitting final boss, as a mass murderer, or she's been thwarted and possibly killed. If that's the case, then remember, I did think about this in advance, she was only in charge of this cell of F3. As news of her failure reaches the biohacking facility, plans are made to evacuate the remaining Signogene material, and key scientist Joseph Harvey with it, to a new secure location. This operation will be led by Cassandra's superior, and he's already on the way. So in this instance, we have an even more senior F3 person. We've got a new clock running down all the time, and the likelihood that if the party fails, then Signogene technology will be out there forever, in criminal hands or the hands of the highest bidder, which, let's face it, are usually the same thing. We will never be able to put the giant mushroom cloud back in the shiny little bomb casing. So there you go. That's a brief overview of our plot in a bit more detail, with some characters, locations, and a narrative order covered, at least superficially. So next time, we're going to break down the first of the chapters of the campaign, the biohacking facility chapter, and provide the clues that the PCs need to deal with the dangers found there. It's finally time to start writing the actual meat of the narrative. But I've whittled on long enough on this particular segment for tonight, so we'll do that next time.